welcome everybody to this session, Pricing Value, where to draw a line between incentive alignments and commoditization. I'm Maria Roldi from the Government Outcome Labs, and I'm your chair for this session today. This is the last big picture session of the conference, and as other big picture session, our aim is to stimulate a conversation and keeping it quite high level. This is not a session where we are going to discuss the technical details on how you price value, which technique, which tool we need to use. The general topic is what we really care about is how do you uphold public value? And many in the audience are working on outcome-based contract like social impact bonds, but other form of contract. And in order to uphold public value, what is done is to define what outcomes are, what represents value, we measure it, and we need to attach a monetary price to it. But who is defining this value? Who designed these metrics? This is not just a technical issue. There are moral considerations and there are ethical issues. So in some policy domain, it seems that the conversation on is this the right way to do things? Is it helpful to define, measure, and price outcomes? Is it helpful to uphold public value, or is it difficult? Has progressed in different ways across different disciplines. So in healthcare, it seems we had much academic debate and practice where there are techniques and tools that are used to define, measure, and price outcome. So the discussion today is about this cross-fertilization. And with our panelists, we would like to explore what can we learn from other sectors, understand if there was anything helpful there that we can transport to other policy domain, or maybe just discuss a different ways of doing things. Maybe we should approach this in a completely different way. To facilitate this discussion today, I'm joined by 4 speakers, as you have seen in the program. We have Adrian Taus. He's the director of the Office of Health Economics here in the UK. Adrian has a distinguished career as health economist, as an academic, a practitioner, and policy advisor. His main interest these days is trying to understand how you set up the right incentives for new drugs, vaccines, to look at risk-sharing designs to share the risk between pharmaceutical company and those who pay health outcomes. So you can see how this is relevant to the conversation that many in our audience are involved in. And I've asked Adrian to give us a little bit of a background and reflect on the experience of health economists in measuring and pricing outcomes. We then have Rachel Silverman. She is a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. She's based in France, but the Center for Global Development is a global institution. And she's leading the research on financing global health and also designing incentive structures. She has significant experience on result-based financing. So I asked Rachel to complement Adrian's reflection on the use of tools and metrics in health economics to the world of result-based financing that is more familiar with many of us in the audience. We have Mildred Warner, who is a professor in city and regional planning at Cornell University in the US. She's an international expert on local government and service deliveries, local service delivery. She has published extensively on the use of privatization and market-based approaches to public service delivery, including the use of social impact bond. She has been attending the Social Outcome Conference since the first edition in like 5 years ago. So she is a familiar face. And I asked her to help us move beyond the lessons from health economists and result-based finance in healthcare to the general domain of social outcome, improving social outcomes. And I asked her to reflect on whether these approaches are helpful to create positive social change. Finally, we have ours truly, Joe Wolf. He is the Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy here at the Blavatnik School of Government. Currently, he's interested in studying how we can revitalize democracy and civil society, but he has in the past published extensively on equality, disadvantage. He's an expert in regulation for gambling and use of recreational drugs. I asked Joe to bring his perspective on based on various policy domain and his knowledge of as a moral philosopher on the strengths and weaknesses on measuring and pricing outcomes. So we have a very formidable panel, very distinguished, that will, I hope, stimulate a great debate. The way we are running this session is as follows. We have 15 minutes for each speaker. I will ask them a question and I offer them 15 minutes to make their contribution and leave time within those 15 minutes for Q&A. Please post the Q&A in the chat as we go along, and we will come to your question at the end of the contribution within the 15 minutes. At the end of each contribution, I will move to a general discussion with the audience. We might pick up questions that we didn't manage to address straight away, and speakers can ask questions to each other and provoke a conversation. So I will say not much more beside that the usual Zoom rule applies. Andrea, can you please, or Mehdi, paste the rules in the chat so we don't lose more time. I just want to draw your attention on the fact that the session is being recorded and will be posted online at the end of today. So with no further ado, I'm coming to you, Adrian. Over the past 50 years, health economists have developed so many tools to measure and price outcomes, and you've been involved in this development throughout your career. Can you share with our audience what are the highlights and lessons learned from this experience? Maybe you can distill for us what have been the key steps in the journey, what was helpful, and what you wish could have been left behind if we could go back. And if you have any advice for those in other policy domains who are interested in measuring and valuing social outcomes. The floor is yours, Adrian.
Great. Thank you, Mara, and thank you for the invite. Well, health economists have worked with psychologists and clinicians over many decades to try and develop outcome measures that measure patient health-related quality of life, so that those who are commissioning and paying for healthcare, third-party payers, usually governments, social insurers, private insurers, can measure how well treatments work in terms of improving patients' health. It was the early 1970s, health economists, psychologists, and clinicians developed and promoted something called the Quality Adjusted Life Year, or the QALY, which is an outcome measure that tries to combine the quantity and quality of life, the two key dimensions of health that we're trying to improve, how long people live and the quality of their lives when they're alive. And quality of life is usually measured using a short questionnaire, such as the EQ5D, 5L, 5D, 5 questions each covering a dimension of health, and 5L, 5 levels at which each of those 5 questions can be answered. And that measures health status, which can then be valued using a population data set. And so an intervention adds more QALYs if it, 1, lengthens life, 2, improves health-related quality of life, or 3, more typically, a combination of both. Thus, we have a generic outcome measure, the QALY, which can be applied across interventions, and that enables payers to make choices about the priorities for their health investment across different disease areas. Of course, not all QALYs are the same. Some groups are more important than others as far as society is concerned, and some diseases are more important to tackle. We can, in principle, have cost per QALY league tables where we list and rank interventions according to how much they cost and what health gain they can deliver at a population level. That way, we know the most efficient ways of spending our health budgets to get as much health gain as we possibly can. Now, in theory, we could use our health budget by starting on the lowest cost per QALY treatments and then buying the next most technically efficient treatment and so on. But of course, it's more complicated than this. We can't provide lots of anti-smoking advice because it's good value for money. and no treatment for metastatic cancer because it's much more expensive to achieve a quality adjusted life year. So we need what economists would call allocative efficiency, which is economic jargon for political decision-making about treatment priorities, which diseases, which groups, and what type of situations. So many countries now make decisions about which drugs and vaccines to use in their healthcare systems using a cost per quality metric via a technique called health technology assessment. Australia was first, beginning in the early 1990s, followed by Canada and then the UK. But as well as high-income countries such as Australia, Canada, the UK, ISA in the United States, we have middle-income countries such as Korea, Thailand, Brazil, and South Africa. Other high-income countries such as Germany use HTA, health technology assessment, but they don't like the generic nature of the quality. So they use other disease-specific outcome measures in their health technology assessment and don't compare across diseases, and they then negotiate on price. But to be clear, they're also using outcome measures to allocate resources, but not the quality adjusted life year. Now, what is very important in the context of your discussions and thinking is that this outcome assessment, this health technology assessment, is typically done ex ante on the basis of randomized clinical trial evidence. Our outcome measures are ex ante and not ex post realized outcomes. I'll come back to this, but here healthcare has two key attributes. Firstly, a strong tradition of randomized clinical trials, so evidence of health effect based on RCTs is expected, indeed regarded as the gold standard by many. And secondly, the licensing bodies, the FDA, the EMA, the drug licensing bodies insist on RCT evidence in most circumstances before the company can market a drug. Thus, the payer, the drug buyer, has some high quality evidence on which to estimate likely outcomes and decide what price they're willing to pay. Of course, even good RCT evidence when the product is launched only allows an estimate of likely outcomes and value for money. So we use decision analytic modeling to add in estimates about costs and about the impact of an effect over time. The trial might last for a few months. We want to know the effect in years. Or it may look at progression-free survival in cancer, but we really want to know about increases in overall survival. So we model the outcomes we want to pay for and how much we think they're worth. I want to talk next, though, about the ex post part. Surely we want to pay for outcomes delivered, not outcomes expected. Well, the economist's answer to that is maybe. It depends, one, on how much uncertainty we have about the outcomes, our ex ante estimates of outcome, and second, how much will it cost to collect the data, to collect the evidence, do the monitoring, do the research we need? In other words, is the benefit going to be worth the cost? But we can measure outcomes through observational studies and by running on randomized controlled trials and following patients on for much longer. And we can adjust payments as a consequence. And we have outcomes-based agreements, which, as Mara said, I've spent some time researching, also called managed entry agreements, but it costs money and takes time to set up these arrangements. They're usually in place for 2 to 3 years. What we find in health is that as far as drugs and vaccines are concerned, we are very good at paying for expected value, but it's still hard and difficult to pay for actual value if we think it's appropriate because of the uncertainty about our estimates at the start. The compromise we see in healthcare is conditional approval. So we pay on the basis of expected value, but collect additional data and adjust our expectation based on that data, especially on price and on which patient groups are going to benefit. So again, just take one example. The UK England has a cancer drugs fund, which is about to become a broader disease fund, which is a pot of money to pay for provisional purchase on the basis of expected outcomes at launch, but with additional data collection so that those estimates can be revised after a couple of years. And that could involve retrospective payments if the drug rebates by the company, if the drug doesn't deliver the outcomes that the NHS was hoping for. So that sort of 2 to 3 year agreement is a sort of compromise, which I think is where we're heading to when there's significant uncertainty at launch about expected outcome. I want my final couple of minutes before I open for discussion is what does paying for value mean? Value-based pricing. Well, in our daily lives, we know the things we'd like to have that require money, effort, or time to achieve. And we know how much money, effort, and time we have. And we have to make choices. We can't have, do, and buy everything. We do what we can on this basis. If we can get things for less money or effort than we're willing to pay or put in, then that's all to the good. In our healthcare system, we have a particular issue with drugs and vaccines, in that by the time they come to market, all of the R&D cost has been sunk and spent. Manufacturing and delivery costs are small in comparison. And secondly, those R&D costs include lots of failures and are global. We can't say how much R&D is relevant to supply a drug in the UK as opposed to in France or wherever. Hence, the better way forward is to pay for the health gain that's delivered or we expect to be delivered. And to do this, we not only need to estimate or measure that health gain, but also estimate how much we're willing to pay, because price equals health gain times willingness to pay for that unit of health gain. Or if we go back to our QALY, price equals number of QALYs times a willingness to pay for a QALY. And we can estimate this willingness to pay based on what we're spending other elements of our health budget on. So what would we need to give up? What is the opportunity cost if we start buying a new drug or vaccine, as opposed to spending that money somewhere else in the healthcare system? So that gives us our standard as to what might be our price or willingness to pay for a QALY that's generated from a new intervention. Of course, if there are competing suppliers, then we might not have to pay the maximum. As in our everyday lives, competition to suppliers means we have choice, and we can trade off price and quality and get a better deal on price for any given level of quality that we want. And if we haven't got very much money, then a smart supplier will offer us a different deal to enable us to buy. Again, in our daily lives, off-peak travel, in my case, a senior citizens discount. And in the context of drug pricing, health systems in middle-income countries will pay lower prices than those in high-income countries. Differential pricing is the economic term. It increases access and increases profits. It's a win-win situation when it works properly. Now, critics of value-based pricing, usually sometimes they regard it as leading to prices being too high, or they think all prices should be cost-based. I think the two missing links are effective purchasing. Firstly, governments shouldn't pay whatever is asked, and they should be willing to say no. And secondly, the role of competition. It's competition that leads to more market entry and to prices that come down over time to long-run R&D costs. And of course, we have patent expiry, at which point prices come down, again through competition, but this time generic competition as a consequence. So my final quick sentence, there's no magic bullet. Measuring outcomes requires evidence, which costs money to collect. Paying for outcomes requires a contracting process. Competition gives you the best deal, but you still need effective purchasing. And finally, you have to decide if the price is worth paying to get the outcomes that you want compared to other things that you can do with your money. I'll stop there, Mara.
Thank you, Adrian. An impressive overview of 50 years of reflection in this space. I'll feed you some of the questions that are in the chat. I have many myself, especially on competition and on the premise that we do have a good measure of outcome. But I'll go to our audience first. So we had Mehdi who said, we're talking about quality in healthcare. Do you think there is space for a generic measure for social issues, like a social quality, socially quality adjusted?
Well, there has to be in principle, and indeed, there have been increasing amounts of research in order to look at, can we find one outcome measure that will cross social care and healthcare, for example, because obviously now we're increasingly in an environment in which we're interested in social care expenditure in terms of managing patients and enabling them to better live their lives on a daily basis, as well as healthcare interventions. So there have been some experiments and trials in that area. So the answer is yes, I think we can work towards those sorts of measures, particularly if we want to integrate elements of expenditure in our programs as well.
Thank you. Can I follow up on this question? Because why do we don't have it yet? So what is coming in the way in your experience?
Well, I think it's partly the silo of healthcare economics and healthcare expenditure and thinking. So in a sense, the emphasis has been on better, more efficiency and understanding of how we best use our healthcare spending, and less thought given to the fact that overall, we're managing other social programs. We're trying to achieve improvements in patients' quality of life that cover a whole number of strands of social programs. So I think it's that we've been too siloed in our approaches and too narrowly focused, and we haven't been working across boundaries.
So thank you. Maybe this conversation is an opportunity to break the silo.
Absolutely.
Sam from the National Lottery has asked, it's a clarification question, and I found it curious too. You mentioned this conditional approval, and you seem to suggest that if the price is not right in the first place, you embed a way to revise the price. Like the model was not quite right, our expected the exact model didn't turn out to be right, so I can give more money because it was better than expected, or ask for a rebate because it was more than expected. Can you say more?
So this is a very important component, because obviously a big issue for healthcare payers is, are they going to pay for something that patients want on the basis of how we hope it will work? But in 2 or 3 years' time, we find that it didn't work as well. And so we haven't spent our money wisely. So the way in which we can overcome that is, and the manufacturer gets immediate access to patients get their medicine, is by structuring it so that if we get the wrong answer and it's not as good as we hope, there can be a price adjustment. And normally we're talking about not putting the shutters down and saying, sorry, we're not using this anymore. We're talking about it being less effective than we hoped. So it can still be used, but with a lower price, and then a rebate built into the contract.
Thank you, Adrian. I think you got us going on a good start. I don't want to dig it into Rachel's time, but there are another 2 questions in the chat. Have a look. We'll come back to those questions in the final 15 minutes.
Great. And, thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Adrian. Rachel, I would like to come to you. As I mentioned at the beginning, you have worked extensively on result-based finance, in particular in low and middle income countries, both in health and other policy domain like education, if I'm not mistaken. I would like to complement what Adrian has said and share your reflection based on your own experience. And then it might be a bit naughty, but I thought if you can use the example of how should we approach measuring and pricing the benefit from a vaccine for COVID, as this is such a relevant and current theme, I would appreciate you to comment on this example. For instance, is the measuring and pricing outcome going to lead to an equitable solution? Because, you know, a richer country can pay more than poorer countries. Couldn't it be just fairer to agree what is a fair price and move on from there? So Rachel, over to you. What is your own experience?
Okay, thank you very much, Mara, and thank you as well to Adrian for his intervention. So, you know, as was introduced, in my remarks, I'm going to try and cover 3 areas. So the first is building on what Adrian's already talked about, talk a little bit about how value-based pricing for pharmaceuticals is similar to and different from RBF for complex health and social outcomes. I think Adrian started this conversation, but I'm going to pick it up and take it a little bit further. The second is how we should think about valuing health and complex social outcomes if you're trying to pay for results via a results-based financing framework. And then looping back to pharmaceutical pricing, which is the specific intervention I was asked to make, why should we think about using value-based pricing for a COVID vaccine, and why is that superior to a fair pricing approach? So zooming out a bit from Adrian's very helpful intervention, I think it's worth understanding how value-based pricing for pharmaceuticals is similar to, but also very different from paying for a more complex health or social outcome. And I lump in health outcomes here. So it's one thing to pay for a pharmaceutical product. It's another to pay, for example, tuberculosis disease outcomes, which requires a complex set of health interventions to achieve. So there is a similar underlying principle, the same underlying principle, which is that we are paying for the amount of good an intervention delivers. We are not simply reimbursing the cost of delivering the intervention. So with pharmaceuticals, what does that mean? For pharmaceuticals, that means we are paying for the amount of health benefit delivered. And with social or health programs, we are paying for whatever outcomes we have designated during the contracting process. But That said, value-based pricing for pharmaceuticals is a bit of a special case for a few reasons. So first, while I would say this, with the caveat that this is certainly contested, certainly by many in civil society, most governments understand and accept that pharmaceutical research and development is an industry, not a social program. And that remains very different from the paradigm of social programs where you often have either government agencies or NGOs delivering care. Second, health gain, as I think we've already talked a little bit about, is a consistent measure that you can use to prioritize across the entire health budget. And the health budget is large. I mean, it's a significant proportion of overall GDP. So to have a single measure that you can use across the entirety of this health budget is quite helpful. Again, with more complex social programs, it's very difficult to assign relative value. So how many averted pregnancies, teenage pregnancies, equal one rehabilitated former prisoner? You're getting into many complex ethical, social questions. And as Adrienne laid out, we have ex-ante experimental causal evidence of a given drug's effectiveness. The drug works through a consistent biological process. We understand that. And we can infer that this experimental evidence should, in most cases, with some level of uncertainty, but with some level of predictability, be externally valid for future populations. This is not necessarily true of most social programs or complex health interventions. They're highly context dependent, and you therefore need to measure and pay against results after the fact if you're going to take this sort of approach. So given some of these differences, how should we think about paying for results or outcomes outside of this very narrow domain of pharmaceutical value-based pricing, and specifically for these complex health and social outcomes? So I guess taking a step back, one thing I think it's very important to recognize is that all funding decisions, no matter the funding modality, make implicit decisions about how much to value different social outcomes. So if we have a program for $100,000, it aims to treat 1,000 people for TB. I'm going to use this example throughout as a point of consistency. That implicitly means the funder is valuing the outcome at $100 per case of TB, even if the funding is through a traditional input-based budget and not through a results-based financing approach. So even if you're not pricing the outcome explicitly, you are implicitly pricing the outcome in your financing decisions. And any competitive tender or grant application process, in a way, is implicitly commoditized. So different implementers are competing for funds based on the outcomes they claim they will be able to achieve. So I think it's important to understand this is not a black and white distinction. There are shades of gray across different kinds of funding modalities, and you don't necessarily escape some of these questions about priority setting or about commoditization just by being implicit about these choices, not explicit. But RBF, like value-based pricing, is different because it takes these implicit choices and it makes them explicit. So why is this good? Why is it good to make these choices explicit? Well, explicit priority setting can be good for its own sake. It requires funders to think critically about their funding choices and why they fund the interventions they do. It can be a remedy to kind of inertia or political decision making. It can force a reckoning with why we set priorities the way we do. There's the accountability argument. We're only paying for results that are actually achieved, and we are rigorously measuring those results. So we are creating a system of accountability that would not necessarily be there. And then there's something around flexibility, autonomy, and efficiency. If you remove funder micromanagement and you allow the implementer to get on with the business of just achieving the social mission, this might create some sort of room for innovation, less paperwork, fewer transaction costs, etc. But under an RBF program, and I think this gets to the crux of what we're talking about today, a funder must decide, not implicitly, but explicitly this time, how much is it willing or able to pay for different outcomes. And I think as we're getting at, this is often a sticking point. So how do you value one social good versus another? And I think as the question from Adrienne's talked about, most field sectors are not yet at the stage where there are consistent accepted metrics that can be paid against sector-wide with a clear understanding of the real opportunity cost. So then what do you do in that scenario? So one way to think about this is that just because you are paying for an outcome and you are setting a dollar, euro, or pound price on the outcome does not necessarily mean you are making an absolute value judgment about how much the outcome is worth in a moral or ethical sense. For example, RBF in the sort of international development and global health context could be used to subsidize or cost share a program with a government. So for example, we might think it's actually worth $200 to treat a person for TB, but we expect the government to fund the remainder. It could offer a bonus for good performance, or it could simply try to mimic or estimate the costs associated with achieving the right outcome. So just funding costs, but through a different avenue. And you don't necessarily need to define the right payment to get many of the benefits of RBF. The priority setting, the accountability, flexibility, autonomy, and efficiency. You can learn over time what a realistic and appropriate payment is by observing different implementers, being comfortable with the idea you might overpay while you're still learning, and that's okay, especially if you're funding NGOs. They now have a little bit of extra money to fund their core mission. And a lot of it's about procurement and the contracting process. You don't necessarily need to make perfect the enemy of the good and figure that you need to find the exact right price to do any of this. So returning to pharmaceuticals and a very real and salient example, which is development of a COVID vaccine. So at a very high level, there are two basic ways we could fund a COVID vaccine, what we call push and what we call pull. A push approach means, imagine you're pushing a boulder up the hill. Governments and donors are using upfront funding to figuratively push the vaccine out the door into market. They pay the cost of early R&D, clinical trials, manufacturing scale-up, et cetera, directly. And then they agree to some sort of fair price, quote unquote, per dose with the company. So why is this problematic? On paper, it sounds good, and I will say this is in practice mostly what is happening. Well, it could work, and I think we all hope it works, but governments have now taken on all the risk of failure. If a vaccine doesn't work, they've still paid for all of these costs upfront. Governments end up in the position of picking winners. They need to choose which candidates to invest in, and their rationale may not be strictly based on science, but also political considerations. For example, wanting to invest in a British or an American company. In the process of picking winners, governments may also crowd out private investment in other candidates. So if the government selected vaccines fail, there might be no plan B of second wave vaccine candidates that are receiving funding through the private sector. And then importantly, and this gets to the idea of value, there's no commercial incentive to develop a better vaccine. That is, one that is more effective, easier to administer, or appropriate for more population subgroups. Finally, governments are likely to fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy. This is when a government thinks, well, I paid to develop this vaccine, so I might as well use it, might as well roll it out. And I think this is a very human nature, but it could be very counterproductive if there are other better vaccines that have been developed elsewhere, or if the cost of rolling out the vaccine exceed the health benefits from its administration. Because not all vaccines will be equally effective. Some might be only marginally effective, might be effective enough to get approved, but not effective enough to necessarily be appropriate to roll out to the entire population. The alternative to this is what's called a pull approach. And again, now we're imagining we're at the top of the mountain and we're pulling the boulder up the mountain instead of pushing it. And in this case, we're making it clear to companies how much we'd be willing to pay for an effective vaccine, how much we value it. And then we're letting companies compete to develop the vaccine, bring it to market, and then receive those payments. So we're communicating a market signal, and then we're saying, please, industry, go out and develop this. And if you do, we will pay for it. So why is this better, in our opinion? Well, the first is that it redistributes risk. It's not just governments taking on the risk, but companies are retaining some of the R&D risk. So governments are not necessarily going to get stuck paying for a failed vaccine, or alternatively overpaying for a marginally effective one. It gets governments out of the business of picking winners, and it encourages a robust and competitive R&D market. And I think especially in a situation like this, where we have an extraordinary need to get an effective vaccine quickly, that's quite important. So I don't want to frame this as a panacea, that it solves all of the problems of the R&D market. I think that, the point Mara raised earlier about equity across countries, about which countries are in line, I think it's a problem in either case. It's clearly a problem now. It's clearly a problem with the way business is going right now, where countries are making bilateral purchasing agreements with specific companies, often that they've invested in upfront. It would probably still be a problem if we went to paying for outcomes. It's not, it's not a cure-all. But I think that within a narrow outcome measure that we can talk about, which is the likelihood that we bring an effective vaccine to market as quickly as possible, this would probably be a more effective approach. Again, using some of the value-based pricing principles that Adrian laid out in the first part of this discussion. I'll leave it there for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. A great overview. I'll throw in a quick question. We might come back to this at the end, because I found your distinction between drugs and pharmaceutical and complex intervention like TB or other like education intervention, social intervention is a fundamental one. But then you also said, oh, we are making implicit choices explicit. And in pharma, we are really good. But in result-based financing, I'm left with the question like, are we going back to the implicit because it's different, it depends from program to program? It's a big question. I want to park it for now to come back at the end, because there are very provocative questions in the chat, like if we go with this willingness to pay, are we, if there is a high willingness to pay, are we okay with paying very large profits well beyond the potential cost of developing and bringing to market a pharmaceutical? Is that fair?
I think the question, so the question of fair pricing gets raised a lot, especially in pharmaceutical pricing world. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think the right way to think about it is it equitable and is it efficient? Is this a system that's going to produce as much good for as many people as possible? So why would it not produce that? Well, it would not produce that if the prices were so high that tons of people who could benefit from a drug could not afford to take it. And companies were holding the profits from that. It would not be good if tons of people with unmet medical conditions never received innovation. If all the people who are now suffering from drug-resistant tuberculosis, there were no new treatments in the pipeline. That's another way in which this can be quite bad. So I think, fair is a subjective statement. And I think I prefer in this context where we have a very strong sense of what we want, and it's life and death. It's not abstract, it's concrete. It's people's life, it's people being able to live and prosper. I want as much of that as we possibly can get for our limited budget. I guess I'm less concerned about sort of a fundamental sense of, is it fair or is it not? I'm concerned about equity, to be clear. I am very concerned about equity. I'm concerned about people in poor countries being able to access treatments they need. I think the tiered pricing approach we talk about is a really important entry point there. I think it's extraordinarily important that people within a country, no matter their income level, are able to get the treatments they need. But the question of, are pharmaceutical companies keeping too much profit? To me, if someone comes and cures cancer tomorrow, great. Like, I'm not upset that they're profiting from that, as long as the world now has access to this innovation at prices that are locally affordable for anyone. It's a good thing that the person who cures cancer will make profits. That's good. We want cancer to be cured. We want there to be an incentive for that. So to me, this is not a problem, but I do understand this is like a strong point of contention.
Thank you, Rachel. And as for Adrian, there are a number of questions we can pick up right now, but please keep an eye on the chat because some of them are really pointy. So I'm passing the microphone soon to Mildred. This is a change of gear. So Mildred, we've heard views from experts mostly on the health domain. Most of our participants in this conference are not experts in health. So as the purpose of this session is to reflect on what are the advantages and risks of going down this path where we measure and price outcome, and then use this measure and prices to align incentives as both Adrian and Rachel described. We are in the conference in outcome-based contracting looking at this method it seems that we are lagging behind in a way to have a clear common metric across the various social domain, like homelessness and education. I would be very curious to hear your perspective on the use of these approaches in how we justify the public resource allocation to create positive social outcomes. Risks, advantages, what do you see?
Thank you very much, Mara. It's a pleasure, but a little bit scary to be part of this conversation because I'm not a health economist and I don't really understand all the issues with the pricing, but I do appreciate the interventions just now by Adrian and Rachel because they're very helpful in my own education. But for me, it seems the core question that I face with social service delivery is public values versus pricing mechanisms. So when we think about value, we think about all the movements toward a broader array of community indicators to get at a sense at a fuller range of what we mean by human well-being. So think of Amartya Sen's capabilities framework, or Bhutan's happiness scale, or the Buen Vivir movement in Latin America. These are looking to get broader measures beyond simple measures, monetary measures of poverty. Now, what's the purpose of this? And I see two goals. The first goal is to get this broader, more holistic view so that you can justify a more comprehensive response. So if we recognize that people are situated in a human ecological framework with the individual, in their family, in their neighborhood, in their workplace, in a social service delivery system, and then in a national system of social rights. And you can think about how you might work at each of those scales. And the goal here, by building this more holistic view, is to build political will for more public investment where it's most needed. So by showing values across domains, you don't leave social welfare stuck in a corner as less than, and instead you reconceive it as a foundation for economic development, for example. And so by building interest and evidence across these domains, we build broader political coalitions to support increasing public investment. So I spent, like 20 years ago, I was using regional economic impact models to value the early care and education sector, both for its forward linkages and its backward linkages in the regional economy. And we use this to articulate care as a social infrastructure foundation for the broader economy. And that helped us garner the attention of economic development policymakers to invest and improve in the early care and education sector. Career ladders for workers, quality indicators for parents, increased government investment. Now, in the early care and education sector in the United States, it is primarily a market sector, and it has many market failures. Lack of quality care, lack of access for parents and kids, wages too low to retain talent. So some of these failures could be fixed with economic development policy tools. Mostly, the US actually needs to recognize that early care and education is public education, and it needs to provide it through a public delivery system that ensures high quality, universal access, and professional wages, like most other OECD countries do. So my goal in articulating the regional economic value of early care and education was to bring one more voice to the table to argue for more public investment in the sector. So this economic development voice would join the human development voice, the education voice, and the social welfare voice to justify enhanced public investment. So I was using valuing not to come up with a price to further financialize the sector, but rather using the valuing to broaden the political will to increase public investment. So for me, the issue is value, not price. Some things we value the most, we can't put a price on, and we don't want to, as that would cheapen them. Human life, human welfare, environmental sustainability. By knowing they have value, we can justify to ourselves morally and politically and economically that we should invest. And that's the goal. But for me, here comes the perversion, and it's in pricing. Because there's a third and fourth goal out there beyond our first two goals of building a more holistic view and promoting more investment. There's the third and fourth goal of financialization and performance management. So to price services based on outcomes and then use that pricing to extract rents. I am not a supporter of this mechanism. I think it places too much faith in the ability of contracts to correctly measure and allocate value to various program inputs. In short, to link inputs to outcomes. As we all know, performance management has real problems in practice, cream skimming, preference misalignment. It is easier and more straightforward in social care to price based on input cost once you have decided on the program structure that you want. And you can use your studies to figure out the program structures that work and then price them according to what they cost. This is an administrative choice. I think there's too much faith placed in market type measures when these are not markets. They're just closed networks. They're quasi-markets at best, with one buyer, government, one seller or maybe a few, one evaluator, and one intermediary who sets the price. Here I'm talking about SIBs. There's no consumer sovereignty here. The consumer has almost no voice because there's no market. We had a session this morning where we talked about the ways to enhance voice, and they weren't using market approaches to get there. They were using other kinds of approaches. This lack of competition means that prices are set by administrative action or by the insiders to the network, or they're set by an oligopolist with outsized power, such as we see in the US with our pharmaceutical firms, or they're set by the financier in some SIBs. So because there's no market mechanism, you can't ensure efficiency or consumer choice. There's no democratic mechanism to ensure accountability, and there's limited external oversight because the evaluator sits inside the network. So what do? Mara asked me for innovative alternatives, but I'm old-fashioned, and I can think of two old models that work no worse than the current experiments and are more subject to democratic accountability. The first is direct public delivery by government. Design the program you want, price the inputs for quality, and pay for the cost of program delivery with no investor premium. The second is publicly regulated delivery by private actors, where you use regulation to control price and ensure quality and access. Now, one example we know for doing this is in public utilities, such as water or electricity. These are natural monopolies or oligopolies with high barriers to entry. They're complex, they're technical, they're hard for the average consumer to understand or see alternatives. And there we see two modes of delivery. One is direct public delivery, for example, municipal ownership of public utilities or the National Health Service. The second is commission regulated private delivery. Here we have public utility commissions, which provide expert administrative oversight to negotiate the price setting. Now, both of these approaches have problems, but are they any worse than the problems we're seeing with SIBs or other value-based pricing schemes? So I offer them as competitive alternatives with a lot longer track record and more research on how they work and how to fix their problems. So let's go back to the notion of pricing for value rather than for cost. No public utility commission allows the electricity companies to claim credit for all economic functioning. Sure, we know electricity is fundamental to the economy, but they base price on a reasonable cost of production, funds for investment, and a fair profit. And this prevents rent extraction. It's not a perfect model, and many communities are now going back to municipal control of water and electricity because they do not see sufficient attention given to equity, access, or environmental sustainability, even when the utility is subject to Public Utility Commission oversight. So these communities have decided they prefer the democratic option of oversight. So the core issue is not the mechanics of measuring this value and turning it into price. The core issue is valuing the broad contributions of social welfare and using this to justify programs that meet our needs.
Thank you, Mildred. Quite a change of perspective. I wonder if Adrian or Rachel would like to offer a quick reaction to this provocation. Like, it's a completely different way of looking at things. We could decide, look at the price and value to decide where to invest resources, but then price based on cost and have a much more direct role, either as a regulator or a direct provider from the public sector. Adrian, I think you've heard some points before.
I mean, Mildred raised lots of issues which are not directly related to health, but I mean, I would agree with her that a key issue is the ability of a contract to link the outcome to to what we want to pay for. So that's the first big issue. I think the questions of direct delivery inputs leading to outputs is, why do we move towards thinking about outcome-based contracts? It's because governments and other providers have difficulty they put more inputs in, but they're not comfortable that they're achieving the outcomes that they want to achieve. So in a sense, we have an incentive issue within public sector providers that, yes, arguably could be addressed through a variety of mechanisms. But I mean, that's part of our challenge. If we don't know how to get the outcomes we want by putting in more inputs and pricing for those inputs, hence the attraction of moving towards outcomes. But I agree, there are other routes forward. It doesn't seem to me that any of them has delivered a knockout blow in my view.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, so I mean, thank you, Mildred, for that intervention. I think it's appropriately provocative and an important counter. I also want to say, I know we are speaking at a conference about social outcomes and social service delivery. That is not personally my background. I work specifically in sort of aid and international development. And when we talk about results-based financing, it's often in the context of a donor-recipient relationship where the accountability mechanisms, alternative accountability mechanisms like democratic accountability, as you say, are not necessarily there, right? Because we're actually operating outside of government relationships. And I think part of the challenge in aid and international development specifically is trying to create some sort of alternative accountability structure when what we would normally hope as the democratic accountability in society is not there or is not necessarily in place in the way we would like it. But I think it's an important counterpoint that if you have functional democratic accountability networks, that is potentially an alternative way to get there. I think the other question is risk. So certainly this is the case in pharmaceutical development, right? It's very difficult to say in a linear fashion, these are the inputs we need to create this outcome of a new pharmaceutical product. It's a very high risk setting. Now, pharmaceutical companies often will overstate how high risk it is and how expensive it is to develop new drugs. So that is a real thing that happens. But it is also the case that I saw a comment in the chat that it's not necessarily the case that the private sector is better at innovation than governments. That is true, certainly for early stage research. And it is also true that, especially in the pharmaceutical sector, they are relying on early stage public research to inform their product development. So that is a very good point. I do think, though, that the commercialization process, choosing which drugs to take through trials, which are often the most expensive part and riskiest part of the pipeline, is a high-risk decision. And there's not necessarily a linear relationship between the inputs that you can value and the outputs. So then you get into the question of risk sharing, which I think is a bit different than when we have an established paradigm that we know with some reasonable predictability will work, and then we can work backwards and value the inputs. Anyway, appreciate the intervention, Mildred, very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thank you for the reflection and the comments that are coming through the chat. We'll come back in the general discussion. There are questions on SIVs and a reprise of a conversation about we should do management by result rather than payment by result. That might link in what Mildred had said in an earlier session this week. So I want to go to our last speaker for today before opening to the general discussion, who is Joe Wolf. So Joe, now the atmosphere is heated. I'm coming to you as you've been working with economists throughout your career, bringing a very strong perspective, for instance, on fairness and equities in models that focus on efficiency. I will leave an open question to you from what you've heard and the perspective from your experience. Can you just reflect in general on the strengths and weaknesses on measuring and pricing outcomes? Does it help to uphold public value?
Okay, thanks so much, Mara, and to Adrian, Rachel, and Mildred for some really fantastic and thought-provoking presentations. So I'm a political philosopher. Over the course of my career, have delved into a number of policy areas. And normally I've been sort of dragged into the policy area rather than choosing to go there myself. And that's true of health as a number of other things. So I just want to say a little bit about the background I have in thinking about value-based pricing in health, how it emerged and why it emerged. I think one thing that's worth saying, it has been mentioned, but it needs to be emphasized, is how peculiar the pharmaceutical market is in the UK or anywhere that's got something like a national health service. Because drugs are patented, new drugs very often don't have a competitor, so there's a monopoly for that drug. And in the NHS, there's a single buyer, pretty much. The private sector is very small. So we have a bilateral monopoly, more or less, and there's no good economic theory for dealing with bilateral monopoly, although it's an unusual bilateral monopoly because one of the parties makes the law so that they can in effect set the conditions if they want to, although the other side could walk away. So we have this very unusual situation where new pharmaceuticals need to be priced. And in the UK, we've had a succession of agreements between the government and industry to try to come up with a pricing scheme. Now, around about 2007, the Office of Fair Trading thought that what we were doing was very inefficient. We had an office of 4 civil servants who were negotiating with the whole pharmaceutical industry to try to sort out drug pricing. And the consultants in the Office of Fair Trading came up with this idea of what is now known as value-based pricing, with the idea that instead of having a negotiation about the price of drugs, or new drugs, they should be priced on the basis of their health benefit. So Adrian talks about quality measure. The idea would be that the more qualities of pharmaceutical provided, the higher you could charge for it. And there are some obvious problems with this. Nigel in the chat said, doesn't that mean that things that, well, the way I think about this, we lose windfall benefits. So some drugs are very cheap and give a huge benefit, and then they would turn out to be very expensive by this method. But perhaps we could look at that. But the question is, why? What was the advantage of value-based pricing? And at that time, there were 2 ideas that were being put forward. One is that we could just save money in the short term, that we're paying too much for some of the pharmaceuticals. But more ambitiously, it was thought that it would change the nature of innovation. Because at that time, I'm not sure it still happened so much, but in 2007, people were concerned about Me Too drugs, where if you were second or third to markets, you only made a marginal benefit. Perhaps people didn't feel so sick or something when they took your drug, so the side effect goes down a little bit. But the clinical benefit over the existing intervention is relatively small, but companies were incentivized to produce these Me Too drugs to get that market. And it was thought that by moving to value-based pricing, you would incentivize pharmaceutical companies to do new blockbuster drugs that made a really big difference, rather than drugs that just tinkered with things. So that was discussed around about 2007. It didn't quite take off. 2011, David Cameron, then Prime Minister, got very interested in this area. And it was announced that value-based pricing was coming in. And so I was consulted again at that time by the pharmaceutical industry, because something else had happened at that time, which was in the assessment of whether drugs should be refunded on the NHS, we use a pound per quality measure. That is, we only at the moment look at the health benefits of those drugs. How much, what health benefits do they have? But NICE, the National Institute of, what was then the National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence, has a document called the Social Values Document, where it tries to point out to other types of social values that we can achieve through health. So, for example, should we be looking at distributive justice? Should drugs for disadvantaged people be given some sort of preference over drugs that go to wealthier people, if there are such things as drugs for disadvantaged people, of course? But should we be looking at the diseases of the poor, diseases of minorities, and should we be giving those drugs extra benefit? And so at that point, value-based pricing was also merged with this idea of social values, and the idea that perhaps we could come up with some sort of multi-criteria decision analysis where we look at both the health benefits and the social benefits in pricing mechanisms. So it was confidently suggested we were going to do this. We didn't do it. I think Adrian mentioned the Cancer Drug Fund. The Cancer Drug Fund might have been a sort of vestige of something like the social values and value-based pricing, but it never really happened in the UK, and we're still in the old system. So what do I think of this? Well, when I was looking into this, when I started working around health, I assumed that the drug budget for the health system was one of the major forms of expenditure in health. That's from all the attention that's given to new pharmaceuticals, you would have the impression that this is really one of the really major expenses of the health system. And I said this at a conference in the United States, and someone said to me very rudely that I should take Health Economics 101, because in fact, when you look at it, when you look at something like the budget of the NHS, I haven't got absolutely up-to-date figures, but we're spending something like 122 billion a year in England on the NHS, and the drug budget is something between 10 and 15 billion. So maybe slightly higher. But then if we look at that again, a lot of that spending is on generics, which are very cheap. So only about half the spending goes on branded. Now, how many of those branded are even under patent, and how many of those drugs are under patent go through NICE system? So in the end, I think when I last looked at this, and apologies, I haven't been able to find figures more recently, when I last looked at it, all the attention was on about 1 or 2% of the NHS budget. So we were paying incredible amount of attention to the supposed profiteering of the multinational pharmaceutical companies. And we were, in effect, letting everything else off. So somehow we had this trick of focusing on this little corner and not looking at other things. Why is that? Well, some things are very easy to measure. Marginal costs are easy to measure. Pharmaceutical costs are easy to measure. And so when you're trying to make savings, it's very easy to look at those things in those areas, not look at your fixed costs, not look at your long-term investment, not look at your overhead, not look at things that are much harder to price. So I think this is, I don't want to go too long, so perhaps I'll just finish on this point. I was very struck earlier, as Sarah Cook said, when you focus on numbers and not on people, you leave the people out. And I think what we've got here is when you focus on marginal costs, you can end up making decisions that are actually counterproductive. So for example, when NICE approves a new drug, no one provides the money for that new drug. That money has to come from existing budgets. So you have to stop doing something in order to afford the new drug. And very often it's something you haven't assessed for its cost effectiveness. So it may well be that we're driving out things that are more cost effective to pay for things that are less cost effective, because we're only measuring this corner of the system. So this is I suppose my point is in two stages, if we're measuring things, if we're measuring the cost of things, we should measure the cost of everything. But then to go back to Adrian's point earlier on, if we start measuring the cost of everything, we put all our money into measuring and not into doing. And so I think we're rather stuck here that we can't afford to do cost effectiveness analysis properly. So should we be doing it in the way we do it, or should we perhaps have another discussion with Mildred and work out what else we might be able to do, even in the pharmaceutical area? So I will finish on those points. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Very thoughtful and interesting that both you and Mildred point out that for you, Joe, in the UK in particular, the drug production is not really as a competitive market as one might think in some cases. So the pricing that is the way it's happening in the UK often happens through negotiation. And so the market mechanism has to be regulated somehow and negotiated anyway. Earlier in the week, in one of the sessions, we talked about competition in these big contracts in the US, where we see often larger player to squeeze out smaller players. So like the evidence shows that few big players might take a dominant position in the market. So the market is not as a textbook example as we might like it to be. I would like to invite, I would like to bring us back, before we go to specific question, to the general topic of this conversation. At the beginning, Adrian, you presented the experience of health economics and how other sector might be learning from the experience. And as our conversation went on, I thought, oh no, maybe it's so complex. So I learned from the comments of Rachel and Mildred that, well, pharmaceutical is a quite easy market compared to social programs. So it might be difficult to measure health outcomes. We've spent 50 years to develop this metric and coming up with a way to price it. And it's an easy case. So the question is, if we move on complex social programs, maybe that's just not fit for purpose, because it's hard enough in healthcare. Can we do it in social program? So can I have your quick reflection on, is it too different, or there are things that we can learn?
Well, this has been really, really interesting. Well, I think firstly, there's the whole question of, can we have composite outcome measures? And it seems to me that's worth investigating. I completely take Joe's point, echoing one of my concerns was that we can spend so much time collecting data that it far exceeds the value of the data that we've collected. But it does seem to me we do need to see if we can come up with composite outcome measures across social programs. And this, in the area of health and social care in most countries, this is absolutely vital, because these are areas of expenditure that are impacting on the same individual that's being cared for, quite often under different programs. And we need composite measures of how useful interventions are. I think the second part, though, is we're getting into the discussion of value-based pricing, and of course, if it's a social program, or indeed an electricity utility, then we know what outcomes we want, but there's no reason why we should necessarily pay full value for that. We can have a competitive process. So if we were contracting for a social program, clearly we need to know how much we're willing to pay before we just abandon the program. It's not worth it. But actually, we're not expecting to pay for value. We're expecting people to bid, and we want to know how much it's going to cost us to get that benefit. And that's what the role of a utility regulator is effectively. Just one final quick comment. I think complex outcome measure seems to me should be on the table. I think we're in danger of mixing up do we want to focus the effort on measuring outcomes and essentially paying for outcomes is different from necessarily paying a price that is the full value of those outcomes. And we're having an interesting side discussion, I think, around Marianne Mazzucato and the whole issue of the role of the public versus the private sector in drug development, which Rachel touched on, which really doesn't affect sort of social outcome programs more generally, but I am finding fascinating.
Thank you, Adrian. Can I draw your attention on, there have been a couple of questions in the chat about risk, premium and rent seeking. So Rachel, you made a point, but also Inga. She's directing a question at Mildred in particular. And she's asking, like she sees SIBs as a type of PPP, public and private partnership, where the private takes on the performance and financial risks. So when you structure the SIB, she says, the unit cost of the intervention is where you start from to price the outcome. But then you need to increase it to taking into account the performance and the financial risk. What is your perspective, Mildred? Is that a sensible way to go about deciding how much to spend and who should receive these payments?
So, I mean, the first question is, who is bearing the risk? And I don't agree with the proposition that we've transferred risk in SIBs to the private investor. At least that's not been the experience in many of the SIBs in the US, where they all have guarantees. We've just turned it into venture capital philanthropy. Is that money, the opportunity cost of philanthropists doing grant making is that they're now backing up private investors on SIBs. The second thing is I think in social care, many of our payments are actually too low. The voluntary sector is underpaid. And in my earlier work in childcare, we have a problem that we were paying too little to childcare providers to keep them in business and to ensure quality. And yet at the same time, it was costing too much for parents to access care. And so you need to really think about, are you going to price for quality, which is what we do in our public school system. We have standards, we have requirements of educational levels, and then we fund accordingly to what it costs. And I think in things like preschool, we know what works. It's not like we need new innovation on how to do preschool. We just need to have the public will to invest in it. So I think we need to be really careful when we're looking at core public services that we know they're important, we know what quality cost, we know the programs that work, and we just need to have the political will to fund them. And playing this game that somehow we need some new financing model to help us improve the quality of the service delivery, I think takes us off track. And it would be so much better. I mean, the conversations yesterday around data and how to actually help empower providers and recipients of services to use data to improve the services for them. I mean, that's really where the conversation ought to be, not in all this conversation about pricing and actually a discussion about risk that I don't think we're being honest with ourselves.
Thank you, Mildred. Mehdi, you are in touch with the chat more than I am because it's very lively and there are too many posting. What have we left behind? There were a very interesting question earlier on that I don't want to leave behind.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, very interesting discussions happening in the chat. I'm going to ask a couple of general questions, maybe to cover lots of these more specific questions as well. I think there were some asking around measuring management or process rather than outcomes. And I think it would be good to hear more about this specific question from the panel. I would say especially maybe Adrian, that whether that's something that could be possible in healthcare, and also Mildred's points I would say would be very valuable. So Adrian, what do you think about this? There are, in the last couple of days that we are running this conference, there were lots of discussions around this. Should we measure for process or management instead of outcomes? And basically the idea is about because it's difficult to find the right metric or measure the outcome, maybe it would be better to do so. What do you think about that?
Well, I think here we've moved away, I think, from pharmaceuticals. Let's say healthcare more generally as an example of an important social program. So I think typically my simple way of thinking about this is ideally we want to measure outcomes. If that's too difficult, we measure the processes. If that's too difficult, then all we can do is measure the inputs and try and make sure we're recruiting highly trained people and they're skilled, and we have to leave them to get on with it, because we can't look at what they're doing and we don't know how to measure the outcomes. So it does seem to me instinctively that that's right. We work backwards. If we think for some reason we just can't assess the outcomes, then the obvious next thing to focus on is the processes. So can we get a better way of measuring and understanding how well those processes work, how well they're being managed, how well they're being delivered? So the answer, I think, from me is yes.
Okay, brilliant. But still, you prefer to measure outcomes. So you suggest that it's best to go with outcomes, and then if we can do so, we go for process. Again, if we can do so, we go for inputs.
Yeah, and let's take the obvious example. When we are personally buying a professional service, let's suppose we need an architect because we want an extension to our house and the council requires a signed planning. How do we choose an architect? I mean, so we look at their skills and their so yes, I think that's the challenge.
Thank you. Mildred, what do you think about this? I think you mentioned that this could be a good alternative. But do you think in programs that are dealing with complex social issues, it's better to measure the process, or maybe not to measure it at all?
I think the revolution in thinking about a holistic approach, and that's what outcomes thinking helps you do, is how everything is connected. And we need to think about those connections. That's for thinking, that's for program design, but that's not for pricing. That's my point. That in underfunded social service sectors that are paying too little for housing the poor, paying too little for early care and education, paying too little for homeless prevention. The issue isn't, so you actually do need to price for quality, and you take this holistic view to figure out what kind of program makes sense. And then you actually use an engineering approach to price for quality, because it's not a market. There's no market out there, forget that. It's an engineering approach, it's an administrative approach. And if you want quality, you price for quality. In early care and education in the United States, we price for cheap and we get bad quality. And if we wanted good quality, we would price for quality, and you would have to double the pay that you give to early care and education teachers, for example. And so we keep pretending that there's some kind of market out there and that we can fix it with a market mechanism, when you know that that market is delivering you low quality, low pay for providers, and too high a cost for parents to access. This is something where it requires a public sector comprehensive holistic response. But we know what to do, and I don't think we need a private investor taking a premium off of it to help us get there. I just think we need to have that broader outcome-based conversation about what we want, and then build the public will to pay for it.
Okay. Yeah, Mara.
I was just picking up on a generic question from Elle, in terms of we've been having this discussion about these marks that are not quite market, picking up right now on your point, Mildred. And how does it, can you share some reflection on how it relates to the work on relational contracting? We opened the conference with relational contracting and David Van Slyke. Can you see a connection? Those are not spot contracts.
Absolutely. I mean, David Van Slyke, remember when he gave us that chart the first day about what the public contractor cares about, the commissioner, as y'all call it in the UK, versus what the private actors are looking for, and how they're aligned, their preferences are totally opposite in terms of alignment. And so when you're doing contracting, in the public utility area, there's been this talk that you really need a civic core at the center to pay attention to equity, to access to long-term environmental sustainability. And so when we're in these contracting networks, which we have to realize are closed networks, you really, if you want your public values at the core, you've got to have actually the public power at the core. And how you get that and how you structure it. I mean, I'm not saying public utility commissions are great, because they're not, but the notion that you need the public at the core, I think is one of the issues. And then, you know, a lot of communities are voting with their feet and going back to municipal ownership because they want a democratic option instead. So I think we need to do work on accountability. And whether it's a market accountability, which works well in a competitive market, which we almost never have in the services we're talking about, or whether it's a public control and accounted through the democratic process, or whether it can be some kind of relational contracting that deals with the accountability challenges in the context of a network governance situation. And that's what David was talking about on Tuesday.
So I'm surprised it is not coming up in the chat, given how many people in our audience have been working on social impact bond. But you say, and this is for everybody, we know how to do things. This is not a market, but it seems that there are these entrenched social problems that we are not able to solve for whichever reason. And so I think in part the interest of bringing in new players from the private sector and that coming up with this very systematic way to measure performance, like, oh, this is the outcome we want to measure, because if we measure it, we can drive behaviors of every stakeholders, of the individual. And so I wonder if this emphasis on we don't need a social investor is taking away the attitude of let's define what good looks like, let's measure it as we go along. Maybe we put too much importance on price, we can discuss that, but it doesn't seem that we know how to solve many of these problems, because if we did, they would be like less prevalent in our society. So I wonder if there is something that happens once you measure and track performance and you put some, you know, financial incentive to make sure that this is happening, or you think there is no value. I don't know if this is happening in pharmaceutical. We are measuring, does it move people? In social, we are measuring, is the measurement and the payment changing the behavior?
So maybe I can just jump in here. So not speaking about pharmaceutical pricing specifically, but more complex health service delivery programs. So this is often a question that comes out, let's say around HIV treatment. There is a wealth of evidence on effective HIV programming. Certainly the biomedical aspects, but also the social delivery aspects of how to engage patients in treatment. Retention on treatment is a huge challenge, and there's a wealth of evidence on how to do this, good studies. And yet, if you look internationally in countries that are getting quite a lot of international financing, the retention rates are very low, 61% after 1 year in, say, Tanzania. And this is not, obviously, there's always a question of having enough money, but if you compare places with good results to places with poor results on these sorts of measures, the funding level is not the key difference. There's something else going. It might be corruption, it might be low effort, it might be any number of things. So I think there's still often the case where you can have micro level evidence about what works, and that's not the same as understanding what is going to make a system at scale work to deliver the kinds of outcomes in complex programs you want. Now, I'm not saying that results-based financing is necessarily like the be-all end-all of fixing that, but a lot of times that seems like the distinction. We have a wealth of evidence on what works at the micro level, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, certainly for HIV treatment, and yet trying to understand how complex systems can work together to deliver that, and where the disconnect is between what we know works at the micro level and we know is not working at the macro level is the challenge.
Thank you, Rachel. In the interest of time, I promised Nigel a few minutes to wrap up the conference. I think the conversation is very lively, and there will be opportunity to stay online after the wrap up of the conference. But some of you might have commitments as we schedule this to finish at 2:30 UK time. So I want to pass the word to Nigel to summarize, give us some highlights about the conference. This is the final session of the closed door conference for those who registered. And I just want to thank the speaker for such a provocative conversation. I think we got good ideas of things that we might learn, like in my case, revising the price, but really questioning why we are doing this, and the management by outcome instead of the payment by outcome came up again as a very interesting proposition. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much to the speakers, to the audience for such interesting question, and to my colleague at the Go Lab, Mehdi, Andrea, Lee, who are doing things behind scene, and the AVT team at the school. So Nigel, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Mara. So I've got the privilege of officially closing our conference. We do have one more session actually in a little bit later today, which will be a public session, which you're all very welcome to join. I'll tell you a little bit more in a moment about that and who's on it. But just before I do, I just do want to make a few short remarks to close the conference. First of all, there has to be a few thank yous. I don't have many, but a massive thank you to all our speakers. We've had more than 100. You've all been amazing. There's been incredibly rich discussions. This is the first time, of course, that we've done a conference like this virtually online. I think we were all very nervous about how it would go, not least because of the technical gremlins that seem to haunt any sort of virtual efforts at some point. But I think we've got through it really smoothly, and everyone has engaged brilliantly. And actually having the chat function while people are speaking has really added, I think, a lot of richness to the discussion. So thank you to the speakers for bringing such thought-provoking reflections throughout. Big thanks to the Go Lab team. There's been a huge team effort across the whole of the Go Lab team in terms of putting this together, inviting people, bringing people in, and making sure it all runs really smoothly. So the team have done an amazing job pulling together on this conference. Particular thanks need to go to my colleagues Grace and Michael. You've all been getting very timely bulletins at the end of each day summarizing what's happened that day. That's thanks to Grace and Michael. But most of all, I think, to Andrea and Lee, who have put their a huge amount of energy into making sure that that everything's gone smoothly and everything was really well prepared and organized. So all of hopefully you've had a really smooth and efficient experience. I certainly have, and that's down to Andrea and Lee, who've done an amazing job there. So virtual flowers and wine, and hopefully real wine at least, will be going their way later on. So that's about it really. We've got a survey going out which we'd love you all to fill in, just so we can get a bit of feedback on how you found it and improve it for next time. Hopefully next year we will be back here in Oxford. Fingers crossed for that. It would be great to see you all back here in person. In the meantime, I mentioned the summaries that we've been sending out each day. They are on our website, so if you want to go back and remind yourself or catch up on these sessions you missed, you can find all of the summaries and indeed the video recordings on our website, and we'll be sending out a bit more information later on today and next week, just sort of wrapping up. There's been too much really in the conference for me to even want to attempt to kind of draw any sort of common threads just yet, but I am working on putting some thoughts together, and I'm sure you all also have an awful lot of reflections to take away from the conference. So that's about it really. Please do stay engaged with the Go Lab between now and next year. Mara mentioned at the start we've got some jobs open for those of you that might be interested. We also recruit our fellows of practice each year, and we're building up an increasing academic network as well, and indeed continuing to run lots of practitioner engagement work, events, webinars, all online, but hopefully again in person again soon. So stay engaged with all of that, please. And all that remains for me to say then is we'll go into some networking in a moment. We can keep up the discussion from the very thought-provoking session we just had, and at 4 o'clock UK time, so in 90 minutes from now, we'll be starting our public talk, which is with Alnor Ibrahim and Sir Paul Collier, which is about reimagining social change in a post-COVID world. So hopefully some big picture, inspiring and perhaps mind-bending ideas for how we might pick up some of the pieces from the COVID crisis in the following years. So look forward to seeing you all for that session. Do stay on the line if you would like to have a little bit of a chat to some of our panelists or some of your fellow audience members. Right now, we'll break you into breakout rooms in just sort of 30 seconds or so from now. But otherwise, thank you all very, very much for your engagement throughout the conference, and see you soon.